Have you ever noticed how the more you chase an avoidant, the faster they run, but the moment you stop needing them, they can't stop thinking about you? That's not coincidence. That's psychology. Because there is one type of empath, just one, that completely disrupts the avoidant's emotional control. Not by begging, not by chasing, not by proving their worth, but by becoming emotionally unshakable. And when an avoidant meets that kind of power, their walls begin to crack. Most people misunderstand what real emotional power looks like. They think the strongest person in a relationship is the one who loves the hardest, gives the most, forgives the longest, and stays no matter how painful it becomes. They confuse endurance with strength. They confuse self-sacrifice with love. And nowhere is that confusion more dangerous than in the dynamic between the empath and the avoidant. Because the empath is often taught that their greatest gift is how deeply they can love, how much they can feel, how much they can hold. They are praised for their patience, admired for their compassion, and often defined by how willing they are to understand the pain in others. They become experts at reading emotional silence, translating mixed signals, and sensing what someone feels even when that person refuses to say it. And at first, this feels like power. It feels like wisdom. It feels like emotional depth. But in the wrong dynamic, especially with someone emotionally avoidant, this gift becomes the very thing that traps them. Why? Because the empath begins to believe that love means staying long enough to heal what hurts the other person. They begin to believe that if they can just love better, stay softer, become safer, ask less, and understand more, they can finally reach the part of the avoidant that no one else has reached. So they wait, they excuse, they overextend. They call it compassion, but often it is self-abandonment dressed in loyalty. And that is where the empath loses their power. Not because they care too much, but because they care so deeply that they begin to disconnect from themselves. Their focus shifts. Instead of asking, what do I need to feel safe, seen, and valued? They begin asking, what do they need from me to finally open up? Instead of measuring whether the relationship is healthy, they measure how much more patient they can become. Instead of honoring what hurts, they explain it away. They stop listening to their own nervous system and start managing someone else's emotional limitations. This is not strength. This is emotional overfunctioning. And avoidants, consciously or unconsciously, are deeply familiar with this pattern. They are used to people overreaching to maintain connection. They are used to people doing the emotional labor for two. They are used to love arriving in the form of pursuit. So when someone keeps showing up, no matter how inconsistent the connection becomes, the avoidant often feels no urgency to change. Why would they? The relationship continues. Access remains. Emotional accountability stays optional. This is why the most powerful empath is not the one who loves the hardest. It is the one who stays grounded in their own center while loving. That kind of empathy is different. They still love deeply. They still feel fully. They still care with extraordinary depth. But they do not lose themselves in the process. They do not confuse understanding someone's wounds with excusing the way those wounds affect them. They do not romanticize inconsistency. They do not turn emotional unavailability into a puzzle they must solve to prove their worth. They remain connected to themselves. And that changes everything. Because a grounded empath does not enter love asking, how do I make this person choose me? They enter asking, does this connection honor what is true for me? That one shift changes the entire dynamic. It means they are no longer approaching love from hunger. They are approaching it from wholeness. And wholeness is what unsettles the avoidant most. Why? Because avoidants are often most comfortable when emotional power is tilted in their favor. When someone else is waiting, wondering, hoping, adjusting, and trying harder, the avoidant remains in control. They set the distance. They control the pace. They decide when connection happens and when it disappears. But the grounded empath does not play that role. They are open, but not available for confusion. They are compassionate, but not self-erasing. They are loving, but not willing to beg for consistency. And that is deeply disorienting to someone who is used to emotional asymmetry, because now distance does not create pursuit. Silence does not create panic. Withdrawal does not create desperation. It creates observation. The grounded empath notices. They do not chase what pulls away. They do not perform emotional labor to keep connection alive. They do not collapse into fear every time intimacy disappears. They simply pay attention. And if the pattern costs them peace, they respond accordingly.
That is power, not intensity.
Not obsession, not endless patience. Power is the ability to remain rooted in yourself while facing someone who is disconnected from themselves. That is what the avoidant does not expect. They expect need. They expect over-accommodation. They expect emotional availability without boundaries. What they do not expect is someone who can love them fully and still refuse to abandon themselves in the process. That kind of presence is rare. And because it is rare, it is unforgettable. Because for the first time, the avoidant is not standing in front of someone trying to earn love. They are standing in front of someone who already knows their worth. Someone who is not asking to be chosen at the cost of themselves. Someone who will meet them with warmth, honesty, and depth, but not at the expense of their own emotional stability. And in that moment, the entire dynamic changes. Because the strongest empath was never the one who could endure the most pain. It was always the one who could love deeply without leaving themselves behind. There is a hard truth most people resist because it challenges everything they've been taught about love. Emotional need does not create attraction in an avoidant, it creates distance. You can be kind, patient, understanding, and deeply invested. But if your emotional state depends on how they show up, you unintentionally give away your power. And once that power shifts, the dynamic begins to tilt in a way that keeps you stuck and them comfortably detached. When someone feels that you need them to feel okay, they no longer feel invited into connection, they feel responsible for your emotional stability. For an avoidant, that responsibility is overwhelming. It activates the very instinct they've spent their life strengthening, the instinct to pull away. Not because they don't feel anything, but because they feel too much pressure attached to what they feel. And pressure, to them, feels like a loss of control. So the more someone seeks reassurance, clarity, consistency, or emotional closeness from a place of dependency, the more the avoidant instinctively creates space. This is the paradox. The very behaviors meant to bring them closer often push them further away. Not because those needs are wrong, but because they are being placed in the hands of someone who is not equipped to hold them. Emotional strength, on the other hand, changes the entire atmosphere of the connection. It does not mean becoming cold or distant. It does not mean pretending not to care. It means your internal state is not dictated by someone else's inconsistency. It means you can experience desire without desperation, care without collapse, and connection without losing your center. When an empath operates from emotional strength, they are no longer seeking to be stabilized by the relationship. They are already stable within themselves. That stability is what makes their presence feel different. It carries a quiet confidence that does not demand, chase, or over-explain. It simply exists. Avoidants are not used to this. They are used to being the one who holds emotional leverage. They are used to interacting with people who react strongly to their distance, who seek answers, who try to close the gap. That pattern reinforces their role. It allows them to remain in control without having to confront their own emotional patterns. But when they encounter someone who does not react in that expected way, something shifts internally. Because now, distance does not produce the same result. It does not trigger pursuit. It does not create emotional urgency on the other side. Instead, it is met with calm awareness. And that calmness is unfamiliar. It removes the predictable cycle they rely on. It removes the reassurance that no matter how inconsistent they are, the connection will remain intact. And in that space, something uncomfortable begins to rise. Uncertainty. For someone who is used to controlling the emotional pace, uncertainty feels destabilizing. It introduces a question they are not used to asking. What if this person doesn't stay? That question is powerful because it shifts the focus away from managing closeness and toward the possibility of loss. This is where emotional strength becomes magnetic, not because it tries to attract, but because it cannot be easily controlled. It does not bend to inconsistency. It does not chase after withdrawal. It does not overcompensate for emotional gaps. It simply remains steady, and that steadiness forces the avoidant to engage in a different way. They begin to notice more. They begin to feel more. They begin to question more, because the dynamic no longer allows them to stay comfortably detached. The absence of emotional dependency means they cannot rely on the other person to maintain the connection for them. There is no one over-functioning to keep things alive. There is no one smoothing over the distance or explaining it away. There is just presence, calm, grounded, and self-contained. And that presence holds a mirror up to the avoidance behavior. It does not accuse. It does not demand. But it reveals. It reveals what effort looks like when it is not one-sided. It reveals what consistency feels like when it is not forced. It reveals what connection could be if both people showed up fully. That kind of reflection can be deeply confronting, because now the avoidant is not comparing this connection to someone who tolerated inconsistency. They are experiencing someone who does not require it, accept it, or adjust themselves to make it work. And that contrast creates emotional tension. Part of them may want to retreat because that is what feels safe. But another part of them becomes curious, even drawn in, because this is different from what they've known. They are no longer being pursued. They are no longer being managed. They are no longer being emotionally carried. They are being met, and being met requires participation. This is why emotional strength is so impactful. It shifts the relationship from a one-sided effort into a space where both people must show up, where the connection naturally fades. It removes the illusion that love alone is enough to sustain something that lacks mutual effort. It replaces emotional dependency with emotional clarity. And clarity changes behavior. Because once someone realizes that your peace does not depend on their presence, they can no longer rely on your attachment to keep you there. They begin to understand, even if only subconsciously, that connection with you is a choice, not an entitlement. And that realization carries weight. It introduces consequence without confrontation. It creates awareness without pressure. It invites effort without demanding it. That is influence at its highest level. Not forcing someone to change, but creating a dynamic where change becomes the only way to maintain connection. And it all begins with one shift, moving from emotional need to emotional strength. There is a moment in every unhealthy emotional dynamic when the pattern reveals itself with brutal clarity. It is the moment one person realizes they have been doing almost all of the emotional movement. They have been reaching first, repairing first, softening first, checking in first, explaining first, pursuing first. They have been carrying the weight of connection while calling it love. And nowhere is this more common than in the cycle between the empath and the avoidant. The empath often becomes the emotional engine of the relationship. They initiate the hard conversations. They sense the shifts in energy. They notice the silence, the distance, the subtle withdrawal. And because they feel so deeply, they do what they have always done. They move toward the disconnection. They try to restore harmony. They ask what is wrong. They offer reassurance. They make themselves more available. They become more patient, more understanding, more emotionally generous. They believe they are protecting the connection, but what they are often protecting is the pattern. Because every time the avoidant pulls away and the empath moves closer, the dynamic is reinforced. One withdraws, the other pursues. One creates distance, the other closes it. One avoids emotional discomfort, the other absorbs it. Over time, this becomes the emotional architecture of the relationship. It stops being an occasional response and becomes the system itself. And systems do not change until someone stops playing their role. This is why the empath who stops chasing changes everything. Not because they become indifferent, not because they stop caring, but because they stop over-functioning in the name of love. That is the shift that alters the entire emotional structure. To stop chasing does not mean becoming cold. It means becoming conscious. It means recognizing that constantly moving towards someone who repeatedly moves away is not intimacy. It is imbalance. It is not connection. It is compensation. And compensation is exhausting. Because chasing is rarely just physical. It is emotional. It is psychological. It is the constant urge to repair what you did not break. It is the habit of reaching for clarity from someone who withholds it. It is the reflex to soothe tension before the other person has taken responsibility for creating it. It is the compulsion to keep something alive that the other person is only passively participating in. The empath often mistakes this effort for devotion. But devotion without reciprocity becomes self-erasure, and eventually something in them begins to wake up. They begin to see that they are not fighting for connection. They are fighting against someone else's resistance to it. They begin to notice that their tenderness has become labor. Their patience has become permission. Their understanding has become access without accountability. And once they see it clearly, they cannot unsee it. That is the beginning of the stop. They stop sending the extra message just to reduce the tension. They stop filling the silence to make the other person comfortable. They stop translating emotional absence into hidden depth. They stop romanticizing distance as complexity. They stop trying to earn consistency from someone committed to unpredictability. And in that stopping, something profound happens. The emotional current shifts. For the first time, the avoidance withdrawal is not met with pursuit. Their silence is not met with soothing. Their distance is not met with desperation. It is met with stillness. And stillness is where the avoidant loses their advantage. Because avoidants often rely on the predictability of pursuit. Consciously or unconsciously, they expect distance to create movement from the other person. They expect someone to notice, reach, ask, reassure, and keep the connection emotionally alive. That expectation becomes part of the structure. It allows them to remain passive while still staying connected. It allows them to avoid vulnerability without experiencing full relational consequence. But when the empath stops chasing, that structure collapses. Now the avoidance distance does not create reassurance. It creates space. And space has a way of telling the truth. In that space, the avoidant is no longer buffered by someone else's emotional labor. They are left alone with the impact of their own behavior. There is no one smoothing over the rupture, no one restoring the warmth, no one absorbing the discomfort so they do not have to feel it. And that is when the emotional weight shifts. For the first time, the avoidant must feel what their distance actually creates. Not in theory, in reality. They feel the silence they once outsourced. They feel the absence of the person who once reached. They feel the missing emotional presence they assumed would always remain available. And because it is no longer being managed for them, they have to face it. This is the moment many avoidants begin to feel something they are deeply unfamiliar with: emotional consequence. Not punishment, not manipulation, consequence. The natural consequence of distance is disconnection. The natural consequence of inconsistency is instability. The natural consequence of emotional passivity is loss. The empath does not need to threaten this. They only need to stop interrupting it. That is what makes the shift so powerful. They are not forcing a lesson. They are no longer preventing one. And that is what changes the dynamic more than any explanation ever could. Because the avoidant may resist your words. They may rationalize your pain. They may deflect your needs. But they cannot ignore the emotional gravity of what changes when you stop chasing. They cannot ignore what it feels like when the person who always carried the connection sets it down. That is when the pattern breaks. And when the pattern breaks, truth enters. Not the truth of what was said, the truth of what was sustained. And who was sustaining it all along? Most people believe communication is what changes a relationship. They believe that if they explain themselves clearly enough, calmly enough, lovingly enough, the other person will finally understand the pain they've caused and choose to show up differently. It is a beautiful belief. It is also the reason so many emotionally aware people stay trapped in cycles that never truly change, because understanding is not the same as transformation. Someone can understand exactly how they hurt you and still continue the behavior. Someone can hear your pain, validate your words, even apologize sincerely, and still remain unwilling to change the pattern that created the pain in the first place. This is the painful truth many empaths struggle to accept. They believe the issue is that they have not been understood deeply enough. But often the issue is not a lack of understanding. It is a lack of consequence. This is especially true with avoidants. Avoidants are often more emotionally aware than people realize. Many of them understand what they are doing on an intellectual level. They know when they are withdrawing. They know when they are becoming inconsistent. They know when they are creating confusion. They know their distance affects you. But knowledge and behavioral change are not the same thing. Insight alone does not interrupt a pattern that still protects them from vulnerability. That is why words so often fail where boundaries succeed. Words invite interpretation. Boundaries create reality. Words can be discussed, softened, delayed, reinterpreted, and emotionally negotiated. Words leave room for someone to nod, agree, empathize, and continue exactly as they have been. Boundaries do not offer that luxury. Boundaries remove the ability to participate in the same pattern without consequence. That is why boundaries are so powerful. They do what words alone cannot do. They make your internal standard externally real. A boundary is not an argument. It is not a threat. It is not emotional theater. It is not punishment. It is a decision. It is the moment your self-respect becomes visible in action. That is what makes it so confronting to someone who is used to access without accountability. When you explain your pain, the avoidant can stay mentally detached. They can intellectualize what you feel. They can reassure you just enough to reduce tension. They can offer words, temporary closeness, or partial effort without changing the deeper pattern. But when your behavior changes, when access changes, when your availability changes, they can no longer engage with your pain as an abstract conversation. Now they have to feel it. That is the power of a boundary. A boundary says, what words often fail to communicate, this pattern no longer gets uninterrupted access to me. That lands in a completely different place, because now they are not being asked to understand your pain. They are being asked to confront the cost of their behavior. And cost is what creates clarity. As long as someone can continue receiving your warmth, your presence, your emotional labor, your patience, and your availability, while giving you inconsistency in return, there is very little internal pressure to change. The relationship may contain discomfort, but not enough consequence to force self-confrontation. They may feel guilt. They may feel tension, but they do not yet feel loss. And people rarely change because they fully understand your pain. They change when they are finally forced to experience the impact of what their behavior costs. That is not cruelty.
That is reality.
The avoidant may ignore repeated conversations. They may delay emotional responsibility. They may minimize your needs, but they cannot ignore altered access. They cannot ignore when the person who always stayed available becomes selective. They cannot ignore when emotional inconsistency no longer receives emotional availability. They cannot ignore when the dynamic stops rewarding the very pattern that keeps breaking trust. That is when something shifts. Because boundaries create emotional feedback that words alone never could. A calm boundary does not argue for your worth. It acts from it. It does not beg to be considered. It decides what will no longer be tolerated. And that is deeply disorienting to someone who has grown comfortable in emotional asymmetry, especially avoidants. Because avoidants often function best in dynamics where intimacy remains available without requiring full emotional participation. They can receive care without fully reciprocating it. They can stay connected without becoming fully accountable to the connection. Boundaries interrupt that arrangement. Suddenly, Love is no longer unconditional access. Care is no longer endless availability. Connection is no longer maintained by one person's overfunctioning. Now participation is required. And that is where many avoidants become uncomfortable. Not because the boundary is unfair, because it reveals what the relationship was costing you while protecting them from having to feel it. This is why boundaries often create more emotional impact than explanation ever could.
Not because they are louder, because they are real.
They are the moment your pain stops being something the other person gets to witness and becomes something they are forced to experience through changed access. And changed access is what makes emotional reality undeniable. For the first time, your absence speaks where your words were previously negotiated. Your restraint speaks where your explanations were softened. Your standards speak where your pain was once rationalized. That is when the avoidant begins to feel what language never made them face. Not your frustration, not your pleading, not your analysis, your limit. And limits are what force truth to surface. Because once access is no longer automatic, the relationship can no longer survive on intention alone. It must now be sustained by effort, consistency, and emotional responsibility. That is what boundaries reveal. Not whether someone understands you, but whether they are willing to meet the standard required to keep access to you. There is a moment in every empath's life that changes everything, and it has nothing to do with finally being chosen. It has nothing to do with finally getting the text, the apology, the consistency, or the emotional availability they spent so long hoping would arrive. The real turning point happens much deeper than that. It happens the moment they stop asking how to be enough for someone who keeps withholding what they need. That is the moment their power returns. For so long, the empath's energy is often spent trying to solve the same emotional question in different forms. How do I make them feel safe enough to open up? How do I communicate better so they finally understand? How do I love them in a way that makes them stop pulling away? Beneath all of those questions is one deeper belief they rarely say out loud. If I can become what they need, maybe they will finally become what I need. That belief is seductive because it feels hopeful. It makes the empath feel active. It gives them something to do with their pain. It turns longing into effort and uncertainty into emotional labor. But what it really does is keep their attention fixed in the wrong direction. Instead of asking whether the connection is nourishing, reciprocal, and emotionally safe, they stay focused on becoming more understandable, more patient, more accommodating, more emotionally skillful. They keep refining themselves in the hope that the relationship will finally stabilize. They call it growth. Often it is adaptation to inconsistency. And adaptation can look deceptively like love. The empath learns to become less reactive to mixed signals. They learn to ask for less so they do not overwhelm. They learn to tolerate silence without protest. They learn to become easier to hold for someone who still does not know how to hold them. This is where many empaths lose themselves without realizing it. Not in one dramatic betrayal, but in small daily negotiations against their own needs. They become so focused on being chosen that they stop noticing what they are choosing in return.
And that is the real fracture.
Because the longer someone organizes their worth around being selected by another person, the more disconnected they become from the far more important question. Is this person capable of loving me in a way that does not require me to abandon myself? That question changes everything. It interrupts the performance. It breaks the trance. It pulls the empath out of emotional audition and back into self-respect. The moment that question becomes real, the center of gravity shifts. No longer is the empath trying to become more desirable to someone emotionally unavailable. They begin evaluating the connection through a completely different lens. Not, how do I get him to choose me? But why am I choosing this? That is where magnetism begins. Not in becoming mysterious, not in becoming unavailable, not in performing detachment. Real magnetism begins when someone is no longer negotiating their worth in exchange for connection. That kind of energy feels different because it is different. It is no longer driven by fear of loss. It is no longer organized around emotional scarcity. It is no longer trying to secure love through overgiving, over-understanding, or over-functioning. It is rooted in something far more powerful, internal permission to stop proving. And when an empath stops proving, everything about their presence changes. Their attention becomes more selective. Their energy becomes less performative. Their care becomes more discerning. Their presence becomes quieter, steadier, less anxious. They no longer enter connection trying to be compelling enough to keep someone close. They enter connection listening for whether closeness is being mutually created. They stop trying to generate intimacy through effort and begin noticing whether intimacy exists through reciprocity. That shift is subtle, but it is enormous, because now the empath is no longer relating from hunger. They are relating from discernment. And discernment is magnetic because it cannot be manipulated by inconsistency. An avoidant feels this immediately, even if they cannot name it. The emotional field has changed. The person who once leaned in harder at distance now leans back into themselves. The person who once over-explained their needs now states them more simply. The person who once tried to preserve connection at all costs is no longer willing to preserve it at the cost of self-respect. That changes the emotional chemistry completely, because the avoidant is no longer engaging with someone trying to win proximity. They are now in contact with someone who is evaluating whether proximity deserves access. That reversal is powerful. The chase is gone. The over-availability is gone. The silent bargaining is gone. What remains is presence without pursuit. And that is what makes the empath suddenly feel magnetic. Not because they are withholding, because they are no longer leaking need. Need seeks reassurance. Need overreaches. Need negotiates. Need performs. But grounded self-worth does none of that. It does not rush to secure what is unclear. It does not overinvest in what is inconsistent. It does not romanticize emotional unavailability. It does not confuse longing with alignment. It simply observes, chooses, and responds. That kind of energy is difficult to ignore because it cannot be easily controlled. It does not bend itself to preserve access. It does not offer endless emotional availability in exchange for fragments of connection. It does not panic when someone pulls away. It pays attention. And attention without attachment is powerful, because for the first time, the avoidant is no longer being loved by someone trying to be chosen. They are being encountered by someone who has remembered they are the chooser too. And that changes everything. Because the most magnetic version of the empath was never the one trying hardest to be loved. It was always the one who stopped needing love to be proven through self-abandonment. There is a moment that arrives quietly but changes everything. It is not loud.
It is not dramatic.
It is not the moment the avoidant finally says the perfect words, offers the long-awaited apology, or suddenly becomes the person the empath spent so long hoping they could be.
It is something far more powerful than that.
It is the moment the empath stops waiting for transformation in the other person and becomes transformed themselves. That is the moment the entire dynamic collapses. For so long, the avoidant relationship survives on one invisible agreement. One person withholds, the other compensates. One creates distance, the other closes it. One avoids discomfort, the other absorbs it. The system holds because one person keeps carrying what the other refuses to confront. And as long as that arrangement remains intact, the connection continues, even if it is painful, even if it is imbalanced, even if it slowly erodes the person doing most of the emotional labor. The avoidant does not unravel because they are deeply loved. They unravel because the structure that once protected them no longer exists. That structure was never just your love. It was your availability without limits, your patience without consequence, your understanding without reciprocity, your presence without standards. That is what made the dynamic sustainable for them. Not intimacy, access. And this is the truth that changes everything for the empath once they finally see it.
The avoidant was not only attached to the connection,
they were attached to the emotional arrangement the connection provided. They were attached to the room it gave them to remain defended while still being loved. They were attached to the comfort of knowing that distance would be tolerated. Inconsistency would be explained, and withdrawal would be emotionally absorbed by someone else. That is why the real rupture does not happen when the empath stops loving. It happens when they stop loving in ways that require self-abandonment. That is the loss the avoidant feels most, not the loss of attention alone, the loss of unconditional access to someone willing to overfunction for connection. Because once that disappears, something the avoidant has often delayed for years becomes unavoidable, emotional consequence. For the first time, their distance is not softened, their silence is not translated, their inconsistency is not absorbed. Their withdrawal is not repaired for them. It lands where it belongs. And that is when the avoidant begins to feel what they spent so long avoiding. Loss, not abstractly, not conceptually, relationally. They feel the absence of the person who once made emotional distance easy. They feel the missing warmth that used to remain available regardless of how little they gave. They feel the collapse of the emotional safety net they quietly relied on while insisting they needed less than they did. This is where many avoidants begin to unravel internally. Not always outwardly, not always in obvious ways. Avoidants often do not fall apart through dramatic confession. They fall apart through delayed emotional recognition, through restless thoughts, through intrusive memory, through the discomfort of realizing that the person they assumed would always remain accessible no longer is. And what makes this so destabilizing is not just the absence. It is what the absence reveals. It reveals how much emotional labor was being done for them. It reveals how much connection was being sustained by someone else's overfunctioning. It reveals how much they received without ever naming it as need. And perhaps most confronting of all, it reveals what they lost, not because love failed, but because they mistook love for permanence. That realization has weight, because now they are not only facing your absence, they are facing themselves in it. They are forced to sit with what distance cost, what passivity cost, what avoidance cost. And there is no one left buffering them from that truth. This is the moment the empath becomes the mirror the avoidant can no longer look away from. Not because the empath is trying to teach them a lesson, not because they are punishing them, but because the empath's transformation removes the distortion that once protected the avoidant from seeing clearly. Before, the avoidant could tell themselves the connection was intact because you kept carrying it. They could confuse your endurance for proof that nothing essential was being lost. They could interpret your repeated return as evidence that the damage was manageable. But once you stop returning in the same way, the illusion breaks. Now there is no more borrowed stability, no more emotional cushioning, no more access without effort, only the unfiltered reality of what their patterns create. And this is what many people misunderstand. The avoidant does not fall apart because the empath becomes harder. They fall apart because the empath becomes whole. Wholeness is what ends the arrangement. A healed empath does not chase closure from someone committed to distance. They do not bargain for consistency. They do not perform patience to earn reciprocity. They do not confuse longing with love. They see clearly. They choose accordingly. And they leave the old pattern without needing the other person to agree with their decision. That is what finally destabilizes the avoidant. Not rejection, reality. The reality that love was offered, the reality that access was sustained, the reality that intimacy was possible, and the reality that it was lost not because it was unavailable, but because they could not meet it without defense. That is the wound beneath the unraveling. And by then, the empath is no longer waiting to be chosen. They already have.